coming. I understand that, everyone's busy even during the holiday seasons, and I hope that I can give some important insights or maybe things that people haven't thought about and have some good discussion about things that have changed as a result of the online format, and also things that I think have just been changing about the event generally that I've experienced as a coach, and also that were quite different from when I was a competitor. Obviously, if anyone has any questions, I can't see everyone's little blurb on Zoom, so feel free to just throw something up in the chat. I have it open right on the sidebar. But obviously, this won't go more than the 45 minutes in terms of the actual presentation, so hopefully we'll have some time for and good discussion and some Q&A. But yeah, as the title of this presentation would suggest, I'm talking about sort of the changing norms that have accelerated as a result of online debate, and a lot of things that I think were just happening naturally that sort of went a bit further as a result of having more tournaments and all the tournaments online. So I think pretty obviously that a lot of the things that online debate have pushed are both temporary and permanent in different ways. There are things that I think are going to be here to stay that have been really good lessons that people have learned from running tournaments, and a lot of different experiments that maybe wouldn't have been tested if not for online debate. And there are obvious things that are entirely temporary. But one of the things that is obvious about speech and debate is that the individuals who are competitors now and become influential in the future are obviously going to push forward norms and ways we do things. So I think I am obviously a very clear example of this. The way I compete and the way I think Congress should be taught is obviously going to influence the way I coach, and that sort of that iterative process over time is going to influence things. So even if in a couple years we are no longer doing online debate, I think obviously those things are going to be quite useful. So I think probably the biggest thing, and there's probably two big things that I've noticed have changed, that online debate has really accelerated democratization of the way tournaments go, who is attending those tournaments, and the way people are engaging with them. When I was a competitor, it was very clear when something was both a national tournament or maybe a local tournament. And obviously those titles still exist, but a lot of tournaments that have been predominated by region have sort of had those barriers broken down as a result of things entirely being online. Probably really good examples of this are even the Sunvite tournament, which happened this weekend. Last year in Sunvite 2020, 70 to 80% of the people who went to that tournament were from Florida. This year, even less than half of those individuals were from Florida. And clearly that's going to influence the way the tournaments are going about, the way that students are going to be interacting and trying to figure out how they're going to make it from point A to point B. And I think that online debate is uniquely important in that regard, and that it creates a system in which individuals who probably never would have met absent this are now able to engage quite frequently as a result of those things. So I think probably the first thing is the democratization of the activity, both in the way people are debating and who they are engaging with. But it also brings into question sort of the norms and practices that each individual tournament is going to bring. And specifically when it comes to preparing students and working with them, obviously the expectations that we have of how tournaments are going to go are going to be quite influenced by that. So I think probably the clearest example is if you are coaching a student and you are trying to talk through them some strategy about how you expect a round to go down, or about knowing the judges and understanding how the round is going to go, that is largely the result of all of those added component parts. And there is a lot of hybridization that I think is occurring right now that probably otherwise wouldn't. So how and what adaptations probably need to be made? I think importantly, we are seeing a lot more judges and competitors who probably would have never met interacting with each other. I remember when I was a competitor, it was very often that tournaments would sort of fit into three categories. You just have your pure local tournaments that maybe had a bid for a finals bid. Now they have it by the total number of entries, so top 16 bid, for example, but had a large predomination by a concentrated group of individuals from an area that knew each other and also had a very similar way of doing Congress. And it definitely influences the strategy that students are going to take, and more specifically, the way they are going to feel that they are the most prepared to enter inside of a round. But now that we no longer have to travel, all of those barriers largely have been removed. And we're seeing a pretty big shift in that individuals who now are able to go to tournaments are definitely going to be changing the way that every single round is occurring. And it's definitely an important strategy that needs to be updated, especially because it's unclear if tournaments aren't already moving in this direction. I think that as Congress becomes more popular, more places start doing it, it is going to lead to just more and more styles, both regional and national, emerging. And I think obviously students need to be prepared for that. But on the back end of this, I think it also means that very idiosyncratic practices are likely to decline as a result of this. And I think that means that as tournaments become more focused on a very unified style of Congress, or a comparatively more unified style of Congress, the individuals who are going to be entering the coaching environment are likely to internalize that. And I think that is likely going to lead to a decline in very specific ways of debating. And this is not just in the styles that individuals have, but also in formalized rules. So things like how many people are in a chamber, restrictions on how long debate can occur, the amount of bills in a packet even, are going to have great influence in how individuals are going to cultivate their skills, and by extension, how students are going to interact with each other in round. So what are things that we can consider as a result? I put this example here that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago. I think Sunvite is a pretty good example of this. So Sunvite is obviously a very large tournament. It's a semis bid or a top 120 or top 60 bid. It's one of the largest tournaments that happens every single year, and is usually very much focused in specific parts of the country. So obviously, because it is hosted in Florida, a lot of people from Florida attend, and that means that a lot of the judges are going to be from Florida, and a lot of competitors are going to be from Florida. And that is going to change a lot of the social dynamics that is going to happen in any individual round. And this is probably the most important thing that Congress brings vis-a-vis many other debate events, is obviously that social interaction is incredibly important. And I think more than really any other event, the individual changes that come from the composition of rounds are going to have the greatest effect on student performance. And I know very specifically that students who I've coached for a couple years, I remember when they would have in-person tournaments, they would look at their chamber assignments and they'd be like, I know 10, 12, or 14 individuals out of maybe an 18 or 20 person chamber. They're now entering rounds where they're like, well, I've never met a lot of these people before. And that strategy and uncertainty is definitely important. From a strategic perspective, very obviously, it influences things like dockets and presiding officers, but is also going to be changing the way that students are going to want to engage with us as coaches. I know it means they're going to be asking more questions about strategy. They're going to be trying to adapt and understand rounds that are more uncertain. And that definitely also changes the workload that we have and how we need to support students in any way we can. And I think that more familiar, less familiar and more foreign environment is also important when it comes to how we want to cultivate team culture and how we want to focus on how students interact with other members of their team. And I think obviously we want to make sure that when students are going into tournaments, they have a really big game plan, because some of the biggest benefits that Congress has, and that's its social interaction, are also frequently its greatest downfalls. I think there is a probably unending conversation that probably needs to be had about whether or not Congress is too social for its own good, and whether or not it inculcates within its broader student population a good way to view each other, as you see just a very big intersection between friendly competition and I think a far more toxic iteration of that competition. And I think it's important to consider that in terms of best practices and things that we can do to support those students. So as I said, democratization still has its drawbacks. I think very obviously, because things are online, students are debating in their homes, they're debating in their bedrooms, they probably don't interact physically with a lot of other people. It's sometimes harder and I think more socially ostracizing to interact with each other. That is, you might get your chamber assignment, but if not everyone has a social media or doesn't always check it regularly, it's going to meaningfully impact the way they're going to enter those rounds. Normally, if you have, for example, a good number of people on your team, you can probably interact with your teammates, obviously, because you also see them at school. But if you are a competitor like me, who was the only person to do Congress from their school, the result was pretty obvious that it greatly limited the amount of interactions that you could have. And basically, it would, when you would go to tournaments, you'd be like, now I can find all of my friends and now I can find all the people I'm going to interact with. But online is definitely a bit more stilting in that regard. And that is, it kind of requires you to already have your foot in the door. And I think that despite the fact that tournaments might be getting bigger, they might be seeing people from other parts of the country, that unfamiliarity can still be quite influential in the way students approach rounds strategically. But it's also going to be harder to sort of adapt and understand the gap between maybe regional or local styles and national ones. And this is definitely important when you consider the way a season is going to go from the beginning to the end. Students who are just starting in the activity are likely going to get their feet wet at local tournaments, and they are likely going to expect Congress to go one way. But when they go to a national tournament, the variables compound and grow so much more aggressively. And I think as a result, it makes those tournaments far more complex. And when it comes to trying to work strategically with students, it's a very big task at times, because there's so much uncertainty that even though things might be coming more representative and there might be more coalescence in one regard, it might also be more daunting in another. And I think that's especially true for students who are newer to the activity, who might notice a very big gap between local styles of Congress and maybe more nationally reflective styles of Congress that you're going to see in out rounds that get immortalized in videos, etc. And I think thirdly is that understanding how team cultures are likely to shift. a lot of students who I coach or have talked to about how online debate has changed the way they focus is that I've noticed a lot more of them are relying on their teams to consider things like prepping and strategy, because now they realize they can't just go to a tournament and say when they check into their hotel, find these 70 or 80 other students who are registered for Congress and strike up a conversation. It's a lot harder to do that. And I think there's a lot more hesitation in that regard. And I think that means that teams might become more inwardly focused, and how we can sort of balance those two things, I think, is incredibly important, because obviously having sort of a good time at a tournament is both a result of whether or not you feel like you are doing well, but also positive social interactions. And I think all of those things are likely to change in the future, especially as online debate enters its second semester. So how are other ways that we're seeing Congress evolving? I think pretty obviously the fact that internet is now a very commonplace practice in a majority of tournaments is one of the most biggest paradigm shifts that we had. When I was a competitor, it was very taboo to use internet in rounds. There was a lot of restrictions about how we can use internet. And the times in which we were allowed to use internet, which when I was a competitor was literally just TOC, was a very welcomed break from what I thought was quite esoteric rules about being able to look things up. But I also think being able to just give speeches in front of a screen, while makes competing a lot more accessible, also changes the way students have to prepare. I know a lot of people who might be entering their first couple of tournaments might be thinking about how daunting it is to do all of their prep and research. And there's sort of an interesting curve that is, once students get into their second, third, or fourth year and they maybe do competitively better, they tend at times to be like, well, maybe I don't have to prep this much, or maybe I don't have to prep this bill. And while it's always wonderful to hear the million reasons why some prep you did 6 months ago is probably just going to be good enough because it's a certain round, I think that allowing students to use internet is both a benefit and a drawback. I think on the one hand, it encourages individuals to be far more vigilant about what's happening in rounds, but I also think it is sometimes just used as a rubber stamp for a lot of things that might undermine the ability for students to do well, and importantly, change the way that all rounds are operating. But probably the most obvious thing is that now that we are debating in front of screens, a lot of things are changing about how we evaluate Congress. I've judged a good number of rounds since we've gone to the full online season, and I noticed that there is a lot of different ways that students are trying to, stand out when they are simply just a 2-inch by 2-inch square on a Zoom call. And those things are going to be very important when it comes to considering how we're going to be preparing students for tournaments, and importantly, how they're going to be entering all of their rounds. But I think the third thing that I would like to mention is that whether or not this is a matter of technical restriction, I think there's been a much greater flirting with smaller rounds. So out rounds now having between 12 and 16 people instead of 16 to 20 or 18 or sometimes 24 if they really want to get large about it, is definitely also going to change the way that individuals need to prepare for tournaments, because when you have less people, obviously they're going to be a greater incentive to whip votes for things like dockets or presiding officers, but also is going to change the way we should prepare strategically to make sure that we can maximize the ability to do well in any individual round. So I think there's probably a big incentive split that happens. So on the one hand, the internet is good, right? Because when I can Google things, I can make sure that things are correct. I can make sure that what somebody's saying is factually accurate. On the other hand, I've noticed a really big uptick in the, well, I'm going to give a crystal. I'll have 50 minutes between the authorship and my speech, give or take, and I'll probably just Google things to make an argument. And I think that especially when students want to focus on maybe out rounds and they might have other work that they want to do, they're like, it's fine. I'll just wing it in prelims. Aside from the fact that this is a pretty great way to potentially increase your chance of dropping in prelims and not having a great time at a tournament, it's also important to focus on how these perverse incentives might be harmful to the overall experience of a Congress round. Aside from the fact that I think in many Congress rounds, specifically out rounds, the fear of speaking at individual times because, these judges don't like hearing speeches that are early, or this tournament never ranks people who speak late, is something that is exceptionally important, and it can essentially derail a lot of rounds if there isn't a lot of focus put upon it and students don't think about strategically. I remember just out round after out round when I was a competitor in which people wouldn't want to give an authorship, they wouldn't want to give a second affirmative under the fear of just being made entirely irrelevant, and as a result the round would have to stall. We'd lose 15 or 20 minutes. There would be bemoans amongst all of the members of the chamber and also all of the observers, and then eventually somebody would provided the authorship or a second affirmative, and then we'd be able to continue on with the debate. But also, I think the benefit of the internet and the changing norms that we have in Congress is about fact checking. this is probably one of the biggest gripes I've had with Congress rules that I think just doesn't make any sense, which is why Congress is so punitive to evidence challenges. So it's unclear to me why we have a lot of these rules. It seems that the only justification is that we want to limit the amount of spurious evidence challenges of people just constantly claiming that evidence is wrong. And the backside of this is that it just sort of leads to a lot of evidence issues in Congress. And I know at a point it might be a little bit naive to assume that every single student is going to have great evidence standards. There is quite a lot of salacious and just outright false evidence that is used in Congress. And I think that the online season has a really good opportunity to counter this. The fact that people can very easily Google and verify things, I think is going to make people a lot more confident about filing those evidence challenges. And I think that is overall good. I think there is never a shortage of good evidence ethics that can exist inside of speech and debate. And I know specifically as a coach, I always want to make sure that students are using correct evidence for no other purpose aside from the fact that it is just like the most honest and just like in best way to do things. But that is not always the case. And if you are coaching 20 or 30 students, it's going to be very hard to look over every individual card. And I think what we're going to see is that over time, as there is going to be more evidence challenges and more acceptance of being able to use the internet and round, those rules which might automatically disqualify people for using evidence challenges or might immediately give them bottom rank are likely going to disappear to what we see in other debate events where people specifically focus on periods in which judges or competitors alike can look at evidence to make sure they're as accurate as possible. And this is always going to feather down into how students are preparing for tournaments, because the ability to engage in these mechanisms not only requires people to think it's necessary, but also requires individual students to augment their prep styles in order to be more conducive to it. So it doesn't just look like saying that you have a piece of evidence and writing it down on a piece of paper. And as I can talk about in some best practices that I think everyone can work towards, these are all things we can make sure that students are holding to account so that if they are ever in a position where they might have an evidence challenge filed against them, that they can make sure that they are doing things properly and that they can be in a better position. But I think this is probably very uniquely important because Congress for a very long time has had a unique problem with fake evidence. That is, in all of the speech activities, there's, I think, much better sourcing that is used. I think that they have done a much better job in making sure that things are legitimate before people are entering rounds. And I think even the more debate-focused events obviously do a much better job as well, because there's periods where you can simply just call for a piece of evidence before the round continues, and it prevents a lot of this just like fake evidence that persists inside of Congress right now. And I think if Congress wants to move forward in being more debate focused and being more focused on argumentation and not things that are just related to speaking, we need to balance these two things. And it's also important to note that if Congress wants to evolve at all, these big structural problems cannot be left behind, because we're going to lose students to both sides of this. That is, students who are more focused in the speech side of Congress will likely move to other events if they believe that there is a deep unfairness, and individuals who are more focused on the debate side of Congress are also likely to leave if they feel like there is a deep unfairness. And that even if it is true that we can't make sure that every single student is maximizing their ability to have good and correct evidence, that there is going to be some self-correction that online debate is definitely pushing forward, because now that tournaments can't really stop individuals from looking things up or having the internet readily accessible, they have leaned into what I think is a far more rational way to handle evidence and the overall coalescence of a round as it relates to its evidence. The second big change is how individual students are debating differently. I know it's kind of ironic that I am talking about Zoom while I am talking on a Zoom, but the thing I've noticed the most about judging online Congress rounds is that there has been quite a marked improvement in, I think, student fluency and speaking. And I don't think it's just the case that suddenly a generation of Congress students decided that they were going to become perfectly fluent and everyone prior wasn't. I think that the online format is just a little bit more conducive to having good speaking. A lot of students who I've interacted with and talked to about how they do prep, they say that they will just have their Zoom on one side of their screen and a Google Doc on the other side of their screen and might read things off verbatim, or they might have a legal pad that is much closer to them. But the fact that we don't do as much hand signals, there's no focus on how we're going to move in, say, the triangle formation that I think Congress has really relied upon for movement, has also meant that judging things solely on how well individual students are speaking versus debating is becoming harder and harder, because the more students are fluent, the more they are able to communicate effectively, the less difference between each individual student, obviously, and the less ability to discern who is doing better and who is going to have higher ranks as a result of that. And this is really important when it comes to understanding how students are engaging in the digital debate space, because a lot of the time when things were in person, it was sort of more obvious how individuals were going to have their own specific style. But it seems that as Zoom and other forms of online debate have grown, there's been sort of this feeling that it's hard to differentiate oneself, that just because you're this little box on the Zoom, it becomes harder overall to sort of stand out, to stand out overall, to stand out inside of a round. Now, obviously, this has two big things that it's changing. First, students need to focus a little bit more on content. That is, if everyone is speaking well, if everyone is doing very similar rhetorical devices, or there is pretty clear structural restrictions because, as it is pretty obvious, students can no longer get up and walk or do all the fun rhetorical flourishes that they could normally, they then need to focus on the more debate-focused side of their activity. And this is not only, I think, beneficial overall to the event, because I think that in order for Congress to move forward, it does need to embrace a more argumentative, focused way of adjudicating without trying to sacrifice the focus on speaking. But it also means that students might find greater amounts of frustration in order to get better. Because I think probably the biggest thing I've noticed that has upticked as a coach is that students more often than not are claiming sort of a degree of arbitrary randomness to results in basically any round, whether it be prelims, semis, or finals. Now, I understand that, sometimes people just want to not think about things that they can improve upon. I'm 20. I obviously want to think that I'm always right about things. It was even worse when I was a competitor. And I know that individuals are always going to say, I had this bad judge, or this judge doesn't like me. But the thing I've noticed is that as fewer and fewer variables can be used in Congress because there's been a greater restriction placed upon us, students, I think, more often than not are going to get more frustrated. And also, as judging becomes more varied between regions and as students know their competitors less and less, that vagueness and unfamiliarity, I think, can breed a very deep level of frustration with the activity. And I think it's incredibly important to sort of talk through with students more than I think when we have in-person seasons, especially because that sort of social drive, and I think that Congress uniquely attracts a demographic of students who are very much focused on being socially interactive with each other and very extroverted, are going to feel that loss in online debate. And I think that can lead to them being quite unhappy with the way the activity is going. And that's not important just because they are in your activity, and obviously we want to care about how our students are feeling, but just because we want to make sure that they're having a good time categorically. And at a point, doing well competitively probably should be subordinate to feeling good and having fun, because I think that really is the reason why you should do speech and debate in the first place. So the last part about this is just some best practices. I didn't want to sort of ramble on how I can fix all of your students' problems, because I honestly really want to hear from you guys more about what problems you're facing and if I can give any prescriptions before I'm just going to ramble out a bunch of solutions. So the first thing, pretty obviously, is just storing evidence. I saw on the schedule there is a thing about cutting cards. Unfortunately, I had to miss that one, but I'm sure it was really exciting because I think evidence ethics is an exceptionally important part of Congress. It's definitely going to become more relevant. Obviously, making sure that students are working on how they can debate on Zoom so they can plan and work strategically to make sure that they aren't just feeling like that the freedoms afforded to them by the online format are allowing them to sort of skimp on prep in the early parts. And I think this is exceptionally important given sometimes the perception that is ascribed to Congress, which is that it's the sort of easy way to do a debate activity, that you don't really have to do a lot of work, that, oh man, don't have to cut as many cards as a PF case because it's only a 3-minute Congress speech. And that really does fetter down to students and how they internalize how they get from point A to point B in a Congress round, and making sure that we can work on troubleshooting and that going into Zoom debates are as easy and seamless as possible is exceptionally important. And I think the third thing is working with students to understand and sort of troubleshoot the bigger uncertainties that they're going to be facing. That is, when they are moving from local to national tournaments and focused on a very different style of debating and interacting with people they've probably never met before in a way that is quite foreign to them, trying to work on strategy for pieces of legislation. Because I think probably the greatest stymieing factor that leads to students not wanting to do the activity anymore is a feeling that it is just very deeply arbitrary and that there is no way for them to get better. I think that is an exceptionally discouraging mentality to have, but I think that is one that is very pernicious and one that gets just a lot worse, in which students feel like, there's nothing I can do because there's so many variables that I have to take into account. And I think probably the last thing is taking advantage of more online balloting and interactions, that students are going to have a harder time knowing their judges and are going to need to rely more on feedback. And I think that those ballots are going to be something that are going to be a lot more important. I know that when I judge online tournaments, obviously I want to write a good amount of feedback for students, but knowing that they may not know who I am, or they may be from a part of the country that I'm not going to see them for another 5 or 6 months, I think pushes me just a little bit more to focus on the comments I'm giving, because I'm not going to be able to see them at the next tournament, or they're not going to be able to walk up to me at a meal or at some other point in the tournament and ask me for specific feedback. And I think that this means that online ballots are more important than ever, both from a perspective of a coach, but also from that as a judge. So I think that was just about 25 minutes. So I'm glad I didn't have to get gavelled down. Just a little Congress pun for everyone. But I'd love to open this up for questions. If people also need to get a drink of water, or go to the bathroom, or tired of listening to some 20-something ramble on about how to do high school speech and debate, that's more than fine. I'm just going to unshare my screen, and I'd love to hear what people have. If they have any questions or things they want to ask me about, I'm totally open to that. That's a good question, Jacob. I think, I always like to take the risk. So I'll go with the direct question if people have any.
Yeah, you can feel free to unmute yourself too. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to comment. You're an excellent speaker. I don't have a question, but I'm very impressed with the speech that you just gave and all of these wonderful changes that are taking place within our curriculum and how students are presenting. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Yeah.
It could be about Congress specifically, like Nick was talking about, evidence in general, like he alluded to. Any questions at all, just feel free to unmute yourself.
I don't really have a question either, but Nick, I have to say, when I saw your name, I was like, wait, I remember this name. And so thank you for that amazing presentation. So that's one. And two, I think your coach and everyone is super proud, and we're not offended at all to hear all of that information from a 20-something-year-old. I think it's very impressive. And as far as one thing you did say, it had to do with like students and the competition being from different locations. So this weekend, I actually tabbed for Congress for Sunbite, and I kept telling Allie, I'm like, or Miss Febrance, it's amazing how diverse your pool is. So I think that's something that's definitely going to pop up, where a lot of our Florida students who typically do exceptionally well, or, they go to these particular Florida run tournaments, they're going to start seeing competition they've never seen before, and they're not going to necessarily know how to handle it. So they're going to be making different adjustments. I noticed that this weekend. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah. If everyone has any other questions, it's fine. All
right. I mean, if not, thanks, Nick, for coming and sharing all that with us. It was awesome, very thought-provoking, and a lot of great tips and hints there. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. I hope all of your students are having a fun time, whether or not they are just gearing down from a tournament that's happening or ready to get to the next half of the season, which should be starting soon. I know we have a couple of those big tournaments coming up, and I hope everyone is looking forward to them.
Thank you, Nick.
Yep, thanks again. So we are not scheduled to start our high school level meeting until 10 after 6. So we've got about 15 minutes. If anybody wants to go grab a drink, quick bite to eat, use the restroom, I guess now would be a good time to do that. And we'll get started about 10 after.
I'm gonna go walk my dog.
Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you again.